She was laughing with her younger sister in the garden when her father appeared at the doorway with two strangers, and in that single moment her entire future collapsed into a decision she would never be allowed to make. Her name was Lucia, and she was 13 years old in the year 45 BCE, living in a modest villa outside Rome where the olive trees bent in the wind and childhood still felt eternal. She did not know that her father had been negotiating her marriage for 6 months to a man she had never met, a man 3 decades older than her, a man who needed her family's political connections. Rome celebrated marriage as the foundation of civilization, the sacred bond that produced citizens and secured alliances, the ritual that transformed girls into matrons worthy of respect and remembrance in household shrines. But beneath the flowers and the torchlight processions and the sacred prayers, there existed customs so disturbing that even Roman writers expressed unease about what brides actually endured during their transformation from daughter to wife. Lucia had watched older girls in her neighborhood prepare for their weddings with a mixture of excitement and, something she could not name, a shadow behind their eyes that appeared after the ceremony and never quite faded. She did not understand that shadow until the night before her own wedding, when everything she had been since birth was methodically stripped away in rituals designed to erase the person and create the possession. The preparations began at sunset on the eve of the ceremony, and they started with the most psychologically devastating requirement Rome imposed on its brides. Lucia was brought to the household shrine where the Lares and Penates watched with painted wooden eyes, and she was ordered to surrender every object that connected her to childhood and to the person she had been allowed to become. Her dolls went first, the small cloth figures she had named and dressed and confided in during lonely nights when the adult world seemed vast and frightening beyond comprehension. Then her childhood toga, the garment she had worn since infancy, was removed and carefully folded and placed on the altar as an offering to gods who demanded she become someone entirely new. Her bulla, the protective amulet that had hung around her neck since the 8th day after her birth, was unclasped by her mother's trembling hands and added to the pile of surrendered identity. She stood in the shrine watching pieces of herself accumulate on the altar, and she understood for the first time that tomorrow's ceremony was not a beginning but an ending. Her mother wept silently throughout the ritual because Roman mothers remembered their own transformations and knew exactly what awaited their daughters on the other side of the wedding threshold. That night, Lucia's hair was arranged in a style called the sex crines, 6 braids that had not changed since Rome's founding and that connected her to every bride who had ever surrendered herself to this ancient machinery. The hairstyle required a special iron spearhead called hasta calibaris, the same type of weapon used to kill enemies in battle, now repurposed to prepare a child for the war zone of Roman marriage. The symbolism was not accidental, and Lucia felt the cold metal against her scalp as her mother divided her hair with hands that shook, with memories of her own wedding night decades earlier. A flame-colored veil called the flammeum was draped over her head, obscuring her vision and announcing to everyone who saw her that this person no longer fully existed as an individual. She was becoming a category rather than a name, a bride rather than Lucia, a future matron defined entirely by her relationship to a man she had met only once and spoken to never. The wedding day dawned bright and merciless, and Lucia was awakened before sunrise to be dressed in a tunica recta, a straight white tunic woven specifically for this single day of use. A woolen belt called a cingulum was tied around her waist in a special knot called the nodus herculaneus, the knot of Hercules which only her husband would be permitted to untie that night. The knot was not merely decorative but deeply symbolic, representing her sealed virginity and her body's new status as territory that belonged to a man she barely recognized as human. She was not allowed to eat breakfast because brides were expected to appear fragile and overwhelmed, too consumed by the gravity of their transformation to concern themselves with physical needs. Her father inspected her appearance with the same critical eye he applied to livestock before market, checking that the investment he had made in raising her was properly presented for transfer to her new owner. The auspices were taken at dawn, a priest examining the entrails of a sacrificed animal to determine whether the gods approved of this union between a child and a stranger. The gods approved, as they almost always did, because the priests understood what answers the families paying for their services expected to receive. Guests began arriving at the villa, and Lucia stood in the atrium receiving their congratulations while understanding that every smile concealed knowledge of what she would experience before sunrise tomorrow. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, involving the joining of right hands by a pronuba, a married woman of good reputation who served as a witness to the transfer of property. Lucia spoke the ancient words that generations of brides had spoken before her. Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia, a formula that replaced her actual name with a generic term. In that moment of speaking, she ceased to be Lucia and became simply a wife, a category without individual identity, a function rather than a person. The wedding feast followed, and Lucia sat beside her new husband in a position of honor while relatives and friends ate and drank and made jokes about what would happen later that night. The jokes were explicit and they were directed at her, a 13-year-old girl who was expected to smile and blush appropriately while adults described her imminent sexual initiation in graphic agricultural metaphors. Her husband laughed at these jokes and added his own observations about what he expected from his new property, speaking about her body as though she were not present to hear every word. The feast continued until darkness fell, and then the ritual that gave this wedding its most disturbing character began with a scream that Lucia had been coached to produce on command. The raptio, the mock abduction, required the bride to be torn from her mother's arms while pretending to resist, reenacting the legendary rape of the Sabine women that had founded Roman marriage itself. Lucia screamed and struggled as instructed while strong hands pulled her away from her weeping mother, and she understood that her genuine terror was being interpreted as performance. Her mother wailed the ritual lamentations that Roman mothers had wailed for centuries, real grief disguised as ceremony, real loss masked as tradition. The wedding procession formed outside the villa, torches blazing in the darkness, musicians playing, guests singing songs so obscene that later Roman writers refused to transcribe them completely. Lucia was paraded through the streets toward her husband's house, while the crowd shouted Dallasio, the ancient wedding cry whose original meaning had been forgotten, but whose purpose remained clear, public witness to a private transfer. Young boys ran alongside the procession throwing walnuts at the bride, a fertility symbol that struck her veiled head and shoulders with small painful impacts that she was not permitted to acknowledge. She carried a spindle and distaff, symbols of the domestic labor that would define her existence from this night forward, tools of the confinement that replaced the relative freedom of girlhood. The procession stopped at her husband's door, and here the most psychologically significant moment of the entire ritual occurred in full view of witnesses who would remember and report what they saw. Lucia was required to smear wolf fat and oil on the doorposts, a ritual of purification that somehow made her responsible for cleansing the threshold she was about to cross. Then her husband asked her name, and she spoke the ritual response, Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, confirming one final time that Lucia no longer existed. She could not step over the threshold herself, because that would bring bad luck, and so she was lifted and carried across by her husband, like a package being delivered to its proper storage location. Once inside, the doors closed behind her, and Lucia understood with terrible clarity that she could never leave this house without her husband's permission for the cane her. And Lucia understood with terrible clarity that she could never leave this house without her husband's permission for the rest of her natural life. The wedding guests did not leave. Instead, they accompanied the couple to the bedchamber where the marriage would be consummated. And what happened next was the ritual that crossed every line Rome pretended to respect. The pronuba and other matrons undressed Lucia while guests watched from the doorway, removing the tunica recta and leaving only the cingulum tied around her waist. She was placed on the marriage bed, a 13-year-old girl surrounded by adult witnesses, waiting for a man she did not know to untie the knot that symbolized her sealed body. The witnesses remained nearby throughout the night, listening and occasionally checking to ensure that the marriage was properly consummated and that the bride fulfilled her obligations without excessive resistance. Lucia learned that night that her body was a public concern rather than a private possession, that intimacy in Rome was always shadowed by the eyes and ears of those who enforced conformity. The blood on the sheets was collected as evidence and shown to witnesses the next morning, proof that the transaction had been completed and that the goods delivered were as advertised. She was allowed to sleep only after her husband was satisfied, and she woke the next morning in a house full of strangers, her mother miles away, her childhood objects sitting on an altar she would never visit again. The woman who brought her breakfast addressed her not as Lucia, but as Domina, mistress, a title that reminded her she was now defined entirely by her relationship to the master of this house. She would not see her mother again for 3 months, and when she did, the meeting would be supervised by her husband's household slaves, who reported everything back to their master. Letters to her family were read by her husband before being sent, and letters from her family were read by her husband before being delivered. She was permitted to manage household slaves and direct domestic operations, but every decision required her husband's approval, and every expenditure was recorded for his review. Her husband was not cruel in the ways that Roman law actually prohibited. He did not beat her severely enough to cause permanent injury, and he did not starve her or deny her basic shelter. He was simply indifferent to her existence as a person, treating her exactly as Roman law intended, as a possession slightly more valuable than a slave but fundamentally similar in legal status. She bore 4 children over the next 8 years, burying 2 of them before they reached their first birthday, mourning alone because her husband considered excessive grief a sign of weak character. When her mother died, Lucia was not permitted to attend the funeral because her husband had a political dinner that evening and required her presence to manage the household service. She received news of her mother's death 3 days after the burial, delivered by a messenger who seemed confused when she wept at information he considered routine. Her younger sister married a year after her mother's death, and Lucia sat at that wedding watching another 13-year-old girl surrender her dolls and her name and her freedom. She smiled the appropriate smiles and made the appropriate jokes about wedding nights, because she had learned that Roman women survived by pretending that their destruction had been transformation. Her husband died when she was 31, and she discovered that widowhood offered freedoms that marriage had systematically denied. For the first time since childhood, she could leave her house without permission, write letters without censorship, and make decisions about her own daily existence without male approval. She refused to remarry despite pressure from relatives who found her independence unseemly, and she spent her remaining years managing her dead husband's estate and raising her surviving children. She taught her daughter everything she knew about survival, and when that daughter reached the age of betrothal, Lucia negotiated a marriage to a younger man whose reputation suggested he might treat his wife as human. She could not save her daughter from the system, but she could try to minimize the damage, and that was the only power Roman mothers ever possessed. Lucia died in her 53rd year, old for a Roman woman, and her tomb inscription praised her as a univira, a one-man woman, the highest compliment Rome offered its matrons. The inscription did not mention her childhood name or her childhood dreams or the person she had been before that wedding transformed her into a function. It praised her woolworking and her household management and her fertility, the approved categories by which Roman women were measured and remembered and judged. Rome celebrated marriage as sacred, and perhaps for men it was a ritual that added to their households and their political alliances and their legacy. But for girls like Lucia, marriage was a ceremony of erasure, a ritual destruction of personhood conducted in public and enforced by law and sanctified by religion. The mock abduction that opened every wedding reminded everyone that Roman marriage had begun with actual abduction, and the symbolism was not meant to be ironic. Women were property transferred from father to husband through rituals that made the transfer entertaining for witnesses and spiritually significant for Assam. Civilization built on patriarchal control. The disturbing ritual that crossed every line was not any single practice, but the system itself, the systematic conversion of human beings into possessions through ceremonies that everyone pretended were celebrations. History remembers Rome as a civilization of law and engineering and military excellence. But it forgets the girls who screamed on their wedding nights and were told their screams were tradition. It forgets the mothers who wept at weddings and were told their tears were ceremony. It forgets the women who spent their entire adult lives in supervised confinement and were praised for their virtue when they finally died. Lucia was one of millions, her individual story lost in the machinery of empire, her suffering normalized into cultural practice. But she was human before she was bride, and she remained human after. And the ritual that crossed every line was the one that made everyone pretend otherwise. Rome celebrated marriage. The bride simply survived it.